Hey guys, welcome to another AMA Fireside Chat where we're going to be discussing how to get your dream job. Of course, you know me, Emil Story, co-founder of the Success Mentor, Austin Walters, and co-host for this. And of course, we have the fantastic Samantha Germain, or Sam Germain, executive recruiter in here. Sam, top three things that you would advise someone who is looking for their dream job. Go.
Oh, yeah, this is a tough one. I would say, first of all, learn how to reverse engineer your dream job. And we can talk about that more today. That's a huge, huge one in my mind. Second one would be figure out how to interview really well. Interviewing is a skill. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the way you conduct the rest of your work. It's totally separate. So learn some tips and tricks on how to really thrive there. And I think the third thing I would say is learn how to think from the perspective of the person who might be hiring you into that dream job. So empathize with the situation that they're in life, what they're looking to resolve, really try to understand what their motivations might be, and then you can kind of help guide yourself into being the right person to meet with them at the right time.
It's really great. So you mentioned something about reverse engineering that job. Like, how do you what does that mean? Like, what is reverse engineering? Like, being the ideal candidate and getting that job. Like, what does that actually look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think really the key is that you start at the end. So if you were to think about, right before you retire, you are in the most fantastic job of your life. You're happy, you've been in it for a couple of years, everything is perfect condition, ideal state. You think about that, you figure out what that goal is, and then you work your way backwards. So how do I take the steps today to end up there tomorrow? I think a lot of us end up in situations where you get selected for an opportunity and it's exciting and you're feeling good. You get that ego rush, like someone wants you to join their company. It's so cool. And we don't often think about the long term when we make those decisions. Sometimes it's kind of a short-term reactionary response. So I think being very intentional about, how you're going to construct your path, having that long-term orientation and planning for the future is really huge.
When you said an interesting thing here, and I got to ask a question. So we want to reverse engineer it. That makes perfect sense to me. Super cool concept, by the way. I absolutely love that. And it's definitely, we want to work backwards, right? We always say it's a piece of the puzzle. How do you feel about applying for any job? Like, let's just say I wanted to get a job in finance, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I just want to get a job. What would you tell that candidate? What would you say to that person?
I would say it depends on your stage in life. If you have just graduated university, you're just starting out, it's not the worst idea, really, to say, I just want to get my foot into this company, or I just want to get my foot into this functional area. Once you're a couple of years into your career, I think things change very quickly. Usually by the time you're around 30, I would say, you kind of want to have your path set up at that point. So you really need to be cognizant of where you are. The further you get in your career, the more that each decision really does matter.
I think and to qualify this is when you say 30, if we can be more specific and say maybe you're like 8 to 10 years in your career, right? Because what if you're an international student and you've come to Canada,
Absolutely. Yeah. That's just an approximation, but I would say, if I were to give a range, even as early as 5 years into your career, you need to start being really strategic about what you're setting yourself up for, because people end up having full careers that kind of happen to them by accident, and you don't want to end up in that position. So as early as you can, start to get really strategic and intentional.
Sam, something that Emil and I talk about a lot is brand. And I think, how do you connect brand to getting jobs and getting that ideal role and building this career that you really want and going from that average career to that exceptional career, right? So I'd love to hear from you in terms of what do you look for in terms of someone with an outstanding brand? Like, what does that look like? What does that feel like? How does that connect, right?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think there's a couple of components that kind of come to mind for me there. One is LinkedIn presence. And I know it's a kind of traditional answer, but it matters. And recruiters look, we care. That's usually where we find people. If you're being reached out to in a more passive way, you might not be active in the job market, but someone's coming to you and saying, hey, I think you could do this job. That's how you get noticed by those people. So having a strong presence, engaging in things like thought leadership, doing interviews, that are public, or sharing, I don't know, situations where you're involved in the community in some meaningful way. All of those things really help to set the stage. And beyond that point, I would say one issue that a lot of people I find have in networking is they focus a lot on how many people do I know? They don't focus on how do people know me, and do people know what I can actually do? So I think also when you're going out into the world and you're meeting people and you're setting up your brand kind of in your community, that's a time when you really want to focus on what are people knowing about me, and how do I make sure that that's, aligned with where I want to go.
It's funny because I have to actually laugh because it's something that I always say. Yeah, it's they always said, like, all growing up, they always say, oh, it's about who you know. But I think with like social media and like we're being bombarded with information all the time. It's not so much who you know, but rather who knows you, right?
Totally, I agree. Yeah.
Standing out of the crowd, standing above the crowd is sort of a big piece of the puzzle these days. And, to that point, so let's say, this natural flow, you've applied, you've got a good resume, your LinkedIn's updated, maybe you're posting on the regular and you've drawn some attention, you've got some recommendations on your LinkedIn, you've done all the right things. You get an interview. Okay. Now, let's say, I don't know, how many you want to pick? 5 interviewing tips, 3 interviewing tips? What are your top interviewing tips for people that are in position?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the number one thing I always tell people is go in prepared with questions, because when we get to the end of an interview, whether you're a recruiter like me or you're a hiring manager, one of the times when you really get to know a person is at the end of the interview, and you say, do you have any questions for me? And the number of people who don't have a response is shocking. I think go in with 5 questions in mind. You don't have to use all 5. Maybe you cut down to 3, depends on your timing. But go in prepared with a couple of really strong questions. And when I say really strong, I mean, it shouldn't be basic logistic kind of stuff. You can talk about that later. It doesn't need to happen in the first meeting. Focus on high level thinking. So what is the company's growth strategy? Where do you want to be 5 years from now? Like, what keeps your executives up at night? Understand that, because keep in mind, you're also interviewing them. They're interviewing you, but you're interviewing them. You need answers to these questions to make an informed decision about whether this is the right step in your career. So that's a big tip that I have. Aside from that, I would say be memorable, be unique, especially if you're meeting with a recruiter. We might talk to 50, 60 people in a week. They all kind of blend together a little bit if they don't stand out. So when people have a really unique story, they share something fascinating about their career, they take a different perspective, that makes you stand out. That makes me remember you, and maybe you don't get this job, but I now know who you are, and I will come to you when I have another role. So anything you can do to kind of distinguish yourself is fantastic. I think also answering questions in a linear fashion is something that gets missed sometimes. So if someone is asking you a particular question, answer that particular question and tell a story from start to finish. Make sure that you're not jumping ahead in too many directions. We've only just met you for the first time. You want to make a good impression and pull us into a narrative that we can get excited about and we can get passionate about. Because I so often will feel like I'm a cheerleader for my candidates. I get excited for them. I want to hear everything about them. I want to follow their journey and work together. And so that's a really great way to do that. So those are a couple of things. I also have some things to avoid, perhaps, but I don't know if we want to go there.
I was going to jump into that and ask that question next, and I will. But I do want to say, for the people that we have on the line, if you do have questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. We're happy to answer your questions while we're on the line. But Sam, that was my next question. So we talked about great things that great talent does. Actually, I will say one thing too. One thing that Emil and I always say is, how do you be bold but be professional? And I think that's the memorable piece on, if you're that person that stands out, even if not the job now, this is a job in future, and keeping those connections and relationships is critically important. But we talked about great things that people are doing and can do as candidates. What are things people should avoid, and what are like common mistakes that people are doing that they think might be a good thing, but might
Yeah.
be an error?
There are
About that.
unfortunately a few. When you interviewed people as many times as I have, you start to pick up on some key trends. A couple of things would be time conscientiousness. If you've booked half an hour with me, usually I'm the type of headhunter where I'll start off a conversation saying, I have about 20 questions for you, or however many. That is me giving you an opportunity to understand what the expectations are in terms of your timing and answering those questions. If a recruiter doesn't tell you that right off the hop, you can always ask, what types of things are we going to talk about? How many questions are we going to get through? I just want to make sure I'm using your time most effectively. So be concise. I usually say if an answer is longer than 2 minutes, it's gone on for too long. You can always just pause at some point and leave it to them. Do you have any follow-up questions about this? That way they're able to focus on the most targeted, important information. I think also talking poorly about former employers, former bosses is not a great idea. It is helpful to provide insight into why you're engaging in a job search, because all recruiters, all hiring managers, they all want to know what your motivation is. But when you have that motivational talk, share something that you're really excited about with this new role, or a couple of things that are driving you forward, and share a couple of reasons why, you might have some gaps between that ideal state and where you're at now. But be very careful about how you do that, because it just isn't necessarily the right first impression. And I would also say another key thing in my mind is go into every meeting with an understanding of what your compensation expectations are very clearly. If you don't know what compensation level you're looking for, you probably aren't ready to be interviewing yet. You need to take some time to figure that out. When folks go in without that information prepared, conversation can get a little bit messy. But Emil, I see you have your hand raised. So
Yeah. I just wanted to, Vasi, thanks for asking your question here. So I'm going to read it. If we're looking to navigate our way in a new service line, or something we were doing in maybe a couple years back, let's say we did it a lot of times, many times before. I got to paraphrase it so I get this question right, because I think what's trying to be asked here is, how do we justify the lack of recent experience?
I think honing in on transferable skills is really the biggest piece. So you want to highlight any single thing that you can find as having a degree of relevance that's going to be appealing to them. Focus on that. At the end of the day, a lot of jobs are really transferable, especially in certain sectors. So highlight what you can do. Don't focus on the negatives. Don't focus on, oh, well, I don't have experience doing X, Y, and Z. Focus on the things you do have experience with. And make sure that you're going into a conversation updated on, recent industry trends, anything that's kind of going on in the market that you can really get your hands on in advance. Even if you just show up and it's obvious that you've put some time into researching, that's going to be an appeal as well.
So maybe like an example would be like, a transferable skill might be sales, right? So if let's say you were, I don't know, selling tile before, but now you're selling cars, you could be like, well, it's the sales skills are transferable. So you could use that as a way to sort of bridge the gap, right?
Yeah, you absolutely can. And I think, especially in an example like that, really a lot of sales roles are pretty transferable. And so demonstrating in that case that maybe you have a passion for cars and you have an interest there, you can talk about that, use that. That's not a transferable skill, but that is something that's going to really help you out if you are making that transition. So focus on that component, focus on the core skills, and kind of take it forward from there.
Shelby's got a question that just popped up. What advice do you have for candidates that do not have Canadian work experience, but have international work experience?
That's a tough one. It can be tricky for people, unfortunately. I think looking at larger companies tends to be a little bit of an easier first move. So any kind of Fortune 500 company, especially if you have a very targeted, specialized skill set, that can be where it's easier to get a bit of an in. Sometimes with smaller companies, they're a little bit more hesitant about that, although not always. But at the end of the day, a tip I would say for getting any job is right now it's a numbers game. We are in a situation where there's significantly more candidates than there are roles. And so persistence is key, and it does pay off. It just sometimes it takes a long time. I think the most recent stat I saw said on average, people are applying to about 250 jobs before they're actually getting an acceptance, which is really challenging. And again, this is not a good market from the candidate perspective, but that is the reality of what we're doing right now. So you have to keep working at it.
Yeah.
Samantha, let me jump into this too, because I think we have a few people online and a few people that we're going to be talking to. They're students. They're going transitioning from being students into the market now. So I'd love to hear from you. Like, I know that you operate a lot in that executive space too, but from a student perspective, that's getting their foot in the market. They're going after their first or second roles and really trying to establish themselves. I'd love to hear from you. What kind of advice do you have for them in terms of getting the job, establishing the brand, getting kind of separating themselves from the pack, because essentially they're competing against all the other students that are, so it's not just competition in the market, but a whole new range of people that are coming into. So I'd love to hear your advice for these students that want to differentiate themselves, land the role, and kind of create that career to go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I have worked with students in the past. It's been a couple of years now, but I have some exposure there. And I would say, again, it's always a numbers game. So, keeping persistent. Also, be open to different opportunities. If you are in a position in life where, let's say you're in Toronto and you're graduating. If you don't have anything holding you to Toronto, don't limit yourself to Toronto if you're considering relocating. So you can look at opportunities that are all across the country if you would like. That can be a really great way, because there are certain communities where it's a little bit easier to get a foot in the door, especially if you have certain language skills or things like that. So that's one piece. I would also say be very open about the type of company you're joining. Generally speaking, I recommend for young people to try to start in a high pedigree kind of environment, and then build up the functionality piece and potentially exit later. That's a great way to get your foot in the door. However, a job is a job. We're in a very difficult market. So really just put in the effort, be persistent. And again, distinguishing factors will always help you out, especially if you can show up with, I don't want to call it executive presence at that kind of stage, but kind of executive presence. So go into it with confidence and confidence in yourself.
Yeah, I know that you have a question, and I know there's a question in the chat, but I just want to double click on what you just said there about executive presence, because I think that's important for us to explain to people, like, what does that mean, right? Like, I think that we know what that means, but what does that mean even for a student? How do you actually create that presence so that people know I'm here and I'm someone worth having that conversation with? Because that also is it's a distinguishing factor in candidates, right? So could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really think the most key point here is how you tell your story. And it's a little bit cliched, but if you're going in and you're saying, well, I've had some exposure here, I don't really know about this, I'm not sure how I feel about this, that kind of approach is really not a great sell. If you go in with a ton of confidence and you say, these are things I'm really good at, this is what I want to do with my career, these are my main skills, here's some examples of things that I've done that are in this domain, that is significantly more attractive. So it's the way that you communicate, the way that you storytell, again, using kind of a linear approach and answering questions is another key that kind of distinguishes certain people from others. And also just the tonality of your voice. You don't want to be, shy and weak. Be yourself, own it, show up with confidence, be excited, be enthusiastic. And people do pick up on that a lot.
The question we have here from Vasu is actually very specific. So I kind of like it because we're going to go down this path together, so to speak. So Vasu says he has some experience in due diligence. Since then, he's been in taxation. Now he wants to get back into due diligence. He's completed a certification as a fraud examiner. He's literally asking, how do I go about getting back into fraud and due diligence? I'm sure that he means mitigating fraud and due diligence.
Not performing, hopefully. Well, I mean, first of all, I would say reach out to me on LinkedIn if you want to have a further talk about this. I'm sure there's a lot to this story, so I'd love to connect and help you out one-on-one. I deal a lot in the due diligence, compliance, fraud, forensic kind of investigation type of space, so happy to talk. But like we were saying earlier, you know, focus on showing what transferable skills you have, highlight your background experience, and show that you have an updated awareness of what's going on in that space right now. So do your research, make sure that you're going in with, you know, some recent stats in mind, recent stories in mind, and find a way to connect the two. But again, happy to kind of connect one-on-one, and we could always have another chat and get a bit deeper in that.
Yeah, so just to double click on that for a second, LinkedIn works as well, but you can do it in Maps. So you can actually send her a message within Maps as well. One small piece of advice before doing it, update your, if you haven't yet, update your Maps profile, throw a picture in your profile, and then that way Sam is going to have a much better idea who she's talking to when you have those initial conversations. But feel free to reach out. Yeah, that's a great way to do it. I want to pivot for a second here. I like getting granular on these things, especially with some of the audience. So, kind of a bipartite question or two-part question. Is a cover letter important, and how long should my resume be?
Yeah. Okay. So I will say personally, I'm not a big cover letter fan. I don't know many headhunters who are at this stage. There are still companies that will ask for it. It is a great idea. I would say to everyone, create one cover letter that's pretty generic and then customize it for any roles where you are asked to provide a cover letter. If you're not asked to provide it, I think personally, at this point in time, it's not wildly required. In a situation where it's a smaller company that might have less applicants, that is a situation where it might be beneficial to provide that. But if you're applying to a company that has thousands of people, you're probably having hundreds, if not thousands of applicants, and the likelihood of it being read is quite low. So I would say that on the cover letter piece. On the resume piece, I think any resume over 2 pages long is probably going to struggle a little bit. You should be able to condense the information you have. Generally speaking, I would say in terms of your work experience, 10 to 15 years of background is a great place to kind of highlight. If you have moved around jobs a lot, potentially even less than that, you really want to focus on the most important information on your resume. And you can always leave room for things to talk about in the meeting, but just focus on giving them that key information that they are going to care about. Again, empathizing with the hiring manager and their time, and give them that and leave some room to discuss things when you get together in person.
Let me ask you on this too, because a lot of people ask questions around my resume is not getting through. I'm applying to these jobs, but I'm not getting calls back. Is the keyword search an issue? Should people be thinking about like keywords that should be included in the resume? Is it like what should be included in the resume so that it gets kind of that attention to actually make it from application process to talking to someone? And also that you mentioned before too is building relationships. So if I'm applying for a job, should I be connecting with people on LinkedIn that might be at the organization that could possibly refer me? How do I build that network too of supporters, advocates, sponsors, mentors to be able to kind of push me along that path? So I'd love to hear about that from you.
Totally. So a couple of things to comment on there. In terms of reaching out to people on LinkedIn, absolutely. The biggest key I would say there is make sure that it's mutually beneficial. So if you're going to someone and just saying, I need your help, I need your information, I need your advice, they might not be as inclined. If you go to them with a bit of a different proposition where it feels more beneficial to both parties, you know, I'd love to take you out for a lunch, right? There's nothing wrong with that. People say it's old school, it works, it's great. So find a way to provide some value to them at the same time as they're providing value to you. But I think that's a great idea. On the other piece about the resume, I do think people are a little bit more afraid of the ATS, you know, attack than probably is required in most cases. I will say it's never been an issue anywhere I've worked where people have been screened out because of a lack of keywords. I've always had positions where I look at every single resume. Not all companies do that, so it's good to be aware of and to focus on those keywords. But for your resume, make sure you have a great summary section. That is the biggest thing. So always start your resume with a short summary, maybe 4 or 5 lines of text, and followed by your experience. Again, just focus on that key information, those big highlights. and you'll be good to go.
I love that. There is a question here from Shelby. I just want to ask, have you extrapolate ATS? What do you mean by ATS?
Sorry, that refers to an applicant tracking system. So there has been a lot of kind of ongoing communication on LinkedIn where people are saying that the system is rejecting me before someone's looking at it. Again, that does happen sometimes. Is it wildly common? Is it happening in most cases? I would say no. Oftentimes there are just a very high degree of applicants. I used to work at a company that is statistically harder to get into than Harvard. So that happens. You have times where there are roles that you might have thousands of applicants for. That is generally speaking why people are not selected, just because it is such a competitive landscape right now.
Awesome. Shelby asked, is it best to have a customized resume for every role you're applying to?
So I have an interesting perspective on this. I want to say yes. What I do recommend, which I think is a little bit nutty, but I think it works really well, is have 4 or 5 resumes that you have created in advance that all target key kind of areas that you could potentially work in or would be interested in working in. So for example, we had the question earlier about, due diligence and fraud. Maybe you have one that's really focused on the compliance piece around governance. Maybe you have one that's really focused on fraud and forensic investigation work, that kind of thing, where you really focus on a specific kind of functional area that you're good at, have it built up perfectly for that type of role, and then you can use those. What that does is kind of save you time from having to go back for every single role you apply to customize your resume. This way you just focus on some key skill sets you have those ready to go, and you can just send them off when the time is right.
I think that's a really interesting answer, and I think the thing that's really cool, the takeaway from that is so the answer, as opposed to yes and no, it's kind of like sort of. If you're gonna apply for 250 jobs, because that's what you have to apply to get to land the job.
Yeah.
Like you brought up earlier, and hopefully it doesn't take that long for anybody listening. Hopefully it doesn't take that long. Like obviously our team, Samantha, like we're gonna work to help speed that up. There's no I guess the answer is like, if you're applying for an auditing job, maybe have a resume that's targeted to that. If you're applying for a role with more of a sales company, but with an auditing influence, maybe like talk to that a little bit with respect to your background. And so it's not like your jobs are going to change. It's not like your history is going to change, because you still did work those jobs, but maybe the correlating factors will change, right? So, maybe you would have your tasks more correlated to, the mitigating fraud or due diligence versus the sales piece, right? Is that about right?
Yeah, and one thing I would add on to that as well that I think is a huge component is if you say, I'm going to create, let's say, 3 resumes for these 3 things that I could see myself doing, but then you see a role that's something different, it forces you to question, do I actually want this role? Because I told myself these were the 3 areas I wanted to work in. So now I'm sitting back and I'm thinking really critically about this opportunity. Is this worth investing my time and energy into? Is this something I actually want to do? And maybe the answer is yes, but maybe it's no. It forces you to take that step back and really think about it.
That's awesome.
Sam, there's one piece I wanted to kind of go back on that you mentioned too, and you mentioned as you reach out to people on LinkedIn, making sure that there's value on both sides. And it's something that we talk about a lot around reciprocal value, right? No one wants to get into a relationship where it's one-sided, because there's no benefit to the other side. So, I'd love to hear some examples, because I've provided some in the past to people about how you can provide value, because a lot of people think, I can actually provide them with anything, right? I can't provide a recruiter with any kind of value for the conversation, or I can't provide a hiring manager or a leader with different kinds of value, but you actually can. And I'd love to hear your perspective on what those different value added pieces could potentially be to build that relationship, and not just asking for a coffee chat or asking for this, that, and the other.
Absolutely, absolutely. A couple of things. One piece of value that a lot of people can provide is to give them an experience. So to go out for a coffee or a lunch or a drink or whatever it is that you're meeting up for, to put that on your bill signifies to them that you value their time, you respect their time, and here's a thank you for that time. So that's one very easy thing people can do. Another thing is, if you already have a job, if you're working for a company that maybe Like maybe you're looking to connect with an agency recruiter, and you make it known that, you know, we use agencies. I'd love to learn about your agency in the process. And maybe you end up actually bringing them a role at some point in the future. You know, candidates often become clients. So that's something that can be very appealing to people as well in that particular area. Aside from that, if there's any market intel that you have, any advice, any guidance, even if, you know, maybe someone's looking to hire into a role and you just happen to know a lot about different people who are in the market, you know, maybe the role's not for you, but you have a referral. Or maybe you can give them some insight into what's going on with your peers who do the same type of work, right? So there's a lot of different avenues you can take. Those are the three kind of big ones that I would see.
That's awesome. Honestly, Sam, you've been awesome. Thanks so much for your time. We're hitting that 30-minute mark now, so we'll buzz off. But like I said before, you can DM Sam on LinkedIn. Of course, you can DM on our Maps. It's really easy to connect that way. Do make sure your profile is updated on both LinkedIn and Maps. It's a really good idea. It's a really good idea to make sure that what you do, what you know, all those things are visible. I want to remind you as well, you can always DM Austin and myself if you're looking to explore one-to-one mentorship. We're literally here to help. Our team is here to support you as well. And this session is recorded. This AMA is recorded, so this will be reposted up on our members chat in case you want to go back and review something that was said that may be huge for you. So anyway, Sam, thanks so much for your time. Any last thoughts, Austin?
Oh, this is great, Sam. This is fantastic. I think it was great for the individuals on the call. It's great for the community, and it's really helpful as people are exploring their next step in the job market. So this is very beneficial.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, ditto. Take care.
Take care.